Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mr. Clarke's recorded lesson for 12.4. Just a quick overview what you should be doing as we go through the recorded lessons. In most cases, we'll be filling out some questions that go along with the lessons. And as we go through, try and think about the question before I scroll through the answer and kind of think about yourself, how you might respond. And keep in mind that with the recorded lessons, the more you put into it, meaning the more you pay attention, you focus in on it, you just don't go through the motions and fill it out without really thinking, the better prepared you'll be for our daily discussions and activities in class. This is really an opportunity for you to kind of get a good understanding of all aspects of U.S. history. We're going from the 1920s through the 2020s, and I'm going to do a comprehensive recorded lesson for each section we're going to go through. So this will kind of give you the background information you need to be successful in the course and successful on a daily basis in class. Each of these assignments will be checked in on a regular basis to make sure that you're filling them out completely. When we go through the questions, there'll be a list, usually like a ABCD type of list of the different responses you could put down. Each lesson will have a series of objectives, kind of the main ideas that we'll be looking at, and I'll kind of take you through that before I even go through the recorded lesson itself. So really what we're doing in this particular section is going through the 1920s, kind of as a reaction to the end of World War I, kind of a transition from a wartime back to a peacetime economy. So some of the key objectives from this particular section will be the economic problems and challenges we faced after World War I. We'll explain the economic growth and prosperity of the 1920s, including how Henry Ford and the automobile began to really spark an economic boom during the 1920s. We'll analyze the consumer revolution. We'll look at the bull market, meaning the stock market that went up during the 1920s. We'll compare the different effects of the economic boom on urban, suburban, and rural America. Another suggestion I would have for you as we go through the recorded lessons, if there's any questions that you might have, I would suggest maybe just make a little notation for yourself and feel free to ask any of those questions. You could always email me if you have a really big question as you're working through the recorded lesson. Or when you get to class the next day, usually we'll be discussing what you did the previous night with the recorded lesson. So if you just want to ask that question in class, that would be fine as well. So question one, why was 1918 one of the more momentous years in world history? So if you think about some of the things that are going on in 1918, those would be the type of responses you would put down for number one. So World War I ended on the 11th of November, 1918 at 11 a.m. Kind of an interesting specific moment in history, as there was 3 11s that were kind of all linked together from the time, the date, and the day. It's a good way to remember it as well. An influenza pandemic killed 50 million worldwide, including 675,000 Americans. And when you think about the pandemic, obviously we've dealt with our own issues with the COVID-19 pandemic in contemporary history. And fortunately, we have a little bit better communication and obviously medical technologies and things like that. But back then, during this period of time, obviously, 50 million people, which was a much smaller world population back then, as well died from the flu pandemic. So when you think about the influenza pandemic, why did this kind of hamper or make the transition from war to peace more challenging, both for the United States and even around the world? Well, when you think about contemporary times, you can see the challenges we had back then. Today and compared to back then. And that's what we really like to do in history too, is to kind of find connections between contemporary times and things that occurred in the past. They do say history repeats itself, and obviously it's not necessarily identical in terms of the repeat, but we deal with kind of broad issues and challenges in a very similar fashion throughout history. So as you look at the response for number two, more Americans even died from the pandemic than died in World War I. The loss of lives weakened the American economy, obviously dampened our spirits. It hindered a difficult transition back to a peacetime economy. The first election that took place after the end of World War I was the 1920 presidential election. The Republican nominee, Warren G. Harding, he had a very famous slogan that was pretty appropriate for this period of time in history. And his slogan was a return to normalcy. So when you think about how this might appeal to many Americans, and there's Harding pictured there with his slogan. After dealing with the issues of war, the issues with the pandemic, the sacrifices that were made both on the home and war fronts, people just wanted a sense of normalcy again for themselves. Okay, question 4. Why was the 1920 presidential election a historic election? Who won the election? So when you think about historic, think about which group within society voted for the very first time, and that's women. So after a long history of having women banned from voting in elections for the most part, women for the first time voted. Election returns this year, too, were reported on the radio. Women had received the right to vote after stepping up during World War I. They had done a lot on the home front, gained a lot of respect within the country. And as such, the Congress and the country embraced the idea finally that women should have the right to vote. So the 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, gave women the right to vote. And then the victor in rejection of the Democratic President Woodrow Wilson's progressive ideals, and he wasn't running for re-election, but his ideas were on the ballot and his aggressive foreign policy. Many Americans were attracted to Warren Harding's return to normalcy campaign. Okay, when you think about the aftermath of World War I, why did women and African Americans suffer the most in the years after World War I? Well, during World War I, they had stepped up during the war to fill positions vacated by soldiers. However, as the nation transitioned back to a peacetime economy, they lost their jobs to the returning soldiers. So in many ways, the soldiers were given priority over women and African Americans, seeing as they had put their lives on the line. It seemed natural to many business owners and those who were doing the hiring to put these returning soldiers back into positions within the workforce. 6, what impact did the end of the war have on race relations? If you think of this period of time in history, there's still a lot of issues that are ongoing. Obviously, we still have a segregated South, and the feeling of prejudice was kind of still felt, across the country, not just in the South. Okay, so as you look at number 6, the Great Migration, this had led many African Americans to move into northern cities, in particular during World War I, in search of work. And then with the returning soldiers into a lot of these cities, which now had much larger African American populations, there's a lot of competition, not only for jobs, but also for housing. Some of the nicer apartments and things like that. There was kind of competition amongst the different groups. And if you look at the Great Migration map here, you could see the light green areas where a lot of African Americans moved from. You could see those who were living in the Southeast. They moved into northeastern cities, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City. Those in Mississippi and Alabama, they moved into places like Detroit and Chicago. And then from like Texas, Louisiana, you saw people move directly north into parts of Minnesota, Minneapolis, Davenport, Iowa, Quincy, Missouri, St. Louis, and then also a lot of them moved into the West Coast, Oakland, San Fran, LA. So even though you would figure that prejudice took place primarily in the Deep South, it also took root in other regions of the country. As we look at the race riots that took place in the summer of 1919 in Chicago, you don't think about Illinois being a center for prejudice, but unfortunately we had a very difficult situation in Chicago. We had a situation where they had one of the Great Lakes, in all the Great Lakes, they have like swimming areas. And what they did in particular here is they had a area that was roped off for whites only to swim and for African Americans only to swim. And a young African American boy was in the whites only swimming area, which outraged the racists on the beach. They started throwing rocks at the boy, and he ended up getting hit in the head and drowned. This led to a riot in Chicago, left nearly 40 people dead and over 500 injured in a series of riots that took place over several days after the drowning of the African-American boy. And the one that's gained a little bit more traction in terms of attention in the country would be the Tulsa Massacre. And this is because of the 100th anniversary of that passed in the spring into the summer of 1921. That was the 100th year anniversary in the summer of 2021. When many mobs of white residents attacked African Americans, they had an area, it was called the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is where a lot of affluent and successful African Americans were living in Tulsa, and there was a lot of resentment in Oklahoma in the white community. A lot of these were, it was called like the Wall Street region, I guess, of the African American Wall Street in this Greenwood District, where a lot of investors and business owners, and there's a lot of jealousy there. And the number of people who died was officially updated to 39, but an investigative committee has said that the estimates are probably closer to several hundred opposed to the official number that had come out. And then the official number that came out back in 1921, a little over 100 years ago, was a white leadership in the government who put out that number to kind of minimize the number. But we know that that was a little bit of a low number, and that was greatly underestimated the number of people who died. They burned down communities and they killed. It was really a horrific event. And here's a cartoon that was in a newspaper from the riots in Chicago, showing that the color line had reached the north. You see African Americans and whites, and that line of the water there is a reference to the line that was in the water for the swimming area, where the African American boy was stoned and drowned. Okay, number 8, why did the United States economy struggle after World War I? So think about some of the factors we've even hit upon already. So we had obviously a very competitive job market. We also had a situation too that during World War I, when we were fighting the war, factories are basically operating 24 hours a day. And because they were producing weapons for war, not just for the United States, but also for our allies, then when the war came to an end, obviously a lot of these factories slowed down or even shut down. We had a very competitive job market, inflation, prices of goods were going up. When you think about inflation, as we move into question number 9, one of the reasons why inflation took hold early on is because consumers had remained very patient during the war. A lot of consumer goods were not being produced because they were producing weapons for the war. And then after the war was over, many Americans felt like they'd been patient enough, and demand for consumer goods was much higher than the supply, and hence prices went up quite a bit initially. Another group that struggled in the aftermath of World War I were farmers. So when you think about farmers, very similar situation to the supply and demand that we mentioned previously. During the war, the government subsidies had helped sustain farmers. Basically, the government was paying farmers to continue to produce crops because they needed them for the war effort. Now, once the war came to an end, the government stopped helping, and a lot of farmers began to struggle. And then a lot of them were overproducing their farm products and not necessarily getting the prices they had gotten during the war itself. 11, how did struggling industrial workers react to tough times? When we think about industrial workers during the war, there's a lot of patriotism, a lot of people who were in support of the war, but now that the war was over, they were not as patient as they were previously. And if you think about one of the few powers that a group of workers has is to go on strike. So strikes were called across the country. In 1919, 4 million workers went on strike, which was roughly 20% of the workforce. And they were fighting for traditional things that they often fight for: higher wages, during this period of time, shorter work days. 12, despite post-war struggles, how did America's economy compare to the rest of the world? The United States had emerged during the period of time of the war as an economic giant. comparison to other countries, the United States was much stronger. The United States was the largest creditor nation during this period of time. This means the United States was lending out a lot of money to other countries. New York City had replaced London as the economic capital of the world. 13, after recovering from post-war recessions, how did the U.S. economy fare for most of the 1920s? Well, since the 1920s, as you probably already know, is nicknamed the Roaring Twenties. The United States economy is going to see one of the biggest economic booms in the history of our country during the 1920s. So when you think about factors or signs of a strong economy, as you move into 14, kind of think about what factors might be an indication that the economy is really going well. So naturally, we think about stock prices going up. Factors are producing more goods, workers' wages up. And of course, as wages go up, consumers have increased buying power and they bought goods. Okay, 15, how did Henry Ford revolutionize factory productivity? Ford introduced a series of technological and management innovations to his automobile businesses. Ford's methods included revolutionizing production, improving work conditions, increasing wages. One thing he believed was that if his workers got a higher wage, they'd be more invested in the company itself, and as such, they'd be more likely to work hard. 16, we'll look at some of the techniques here that he used, including mass production and assembly line techniques and how it impacted the automobile industry. So mass production had been used on smaller goods, but Ford thought that it could be applied to more complex automobile production. The assembly line techniques involves a worker repeating the same simple task over and over again. By doing this, this sped up the efficiency in production. So, of course, this was a net positive in terms of how quickly he could produce automobiles. 17, we're going to look at how this increased productivity impacted the price. The earliest automobile that became affordable for Americans was the Model T. And of course, the Ford automobile company is still around today. We see an image here of the early Ford Model T. So the time to produce the Model T dropped from 12 hours to 90 minutes. So in 1908, a car was much more expensive, more than almost triple the price in 1908 versus 1927. So as the price came down, it went from $850 in 1908 to $350 in 1916 to $290 a car by 1927. Compare that to modern day society, and all automobiles go up each period of time that you move forward. So let's say we're looking at 2008, 2016, and 2021, for example. You would see that the same automobile would be going up significantly, usually by several $1,000s from one period to the next. So that's quite a bit different than what we saw here during the 1920s. 18, how did consumer automobile ownership rates change from 1919 to 1927? Well, if you see the prices there, you can kind of make a conclusion in terms of what direction it's going to go. So in 1919, 10% of Americans owned a car. By 1927, when the automobile dropped down to $290 per car, 56% did, which meant most middle class and even lower middle class Americans were now purchasing an automobile. 19, explain 3 ways Ford improved the lives of its workers, and we kind of alluded to the wage increase before. He was treating them basically with a little bit more respect. In 1914, he doubled wages from $2.35 to $5 a day. He reduced the workday, instituting the first 8-hour workday, which is kind of the traditional workday today. 1926, he gave workers Saturdays and Sundays off, which obviously is what we have today is the traditional weekend off from a traditional 40-hour work week. 20 had an increase in automobile production impact other areas of the economy. So physically, just looking at the photograph there of the automobile, what raw materials would you need in order to keep that car running and moving? What else would you need? And once you begin moving place to place, you can even think of this with your own families. What are some things you can do with an automobile? So increased industries like rubber, glass, and steel, they're pretty much the raw materials for the automobile. And of course, if you want to move that car from place to place, roads, bridges, demand for oil and gas, service stations, gas stations. And then as you move along a roadway, eventually highways, you have motels and diners and insurance companies for the cars. And then on the reverse side, railroads and trolleys and things like that, they suffered a little bit and they saw their usage go down. 21, how did the affordable automobile change the way Americans live their lives? Well, think about your own self. At some point in time soon, you might be getting your own driver's license, or maybe you have it already. So you might have a new sense of freedom. You don't necessarily have to rely on somebody else to take you from place to place. Also, we saw the growth of the suburbs during this period of time, as people didn't necessarily have to live in the inner cities. They can actually live a little bit further away from work. Cross-country vacations, Sunday drives into the countryside were all impacted by the automobile. 22, why was owning an automobile symbolic of success during this period in history? This came to symbolize participation in the American dream. The American dream, own your own home, perhaps, a car, have a family. Those are kind of the things that, I guess, stereotypically they emphasized during the 1920s forward. 23, how did a consumer revolution take place during the 1920s? Well, think about revolution first as a word that's a complete change, and consumer, kind of add that to the revolution. So when you think about electricity, that was becoming more widely available during this period of time. This made products for your home a little bit more practical, obviously. Factories began producing innovative products in large quantities, as many more Americans now had electricity in their homes. 24, how did advertisements impact the consumer revolution? Well, think about first what an advertisement is and kind of its goal. Advertisements use new scientific techniques and psychological research to target consumers to sell more products. So when you think about advertisements and ways to promote products, many of these still overlap today. So you have magazines and newspaper ads, billboards, which we still see today, some of which today are now electronic. Now, radio obviously was here. TV was not yet around. So radio commercials and jingles, catchy phrases. You even see in modern day commercials, they often have music there that you kind of associate, or slogans that you associate with a commercial. Celebrity spokespersons are obviously very important. You can see Babe Ruth there promoting Red Rock Cola, the finest cola drink he ever had. And then modern day TV commercials, you have internet ads, browsing history, where they kind of target what you've been browsing for. 26, why do you believe advertisers tend to focus more on the benefits of products rather than the products themselves? Well, what they're trying to do is kind of twist your arm to kind of get you to purchase something that they want to kind of convince you that you need. If you really believe you truly need something, you might be more likely to purchase it. 27, how did the availability of credit impact the 1920s? So credit, obviously credit card is most common. Consumers were buying products on credit or the installment plan. An installment plan is where you, let's say, put down a down payment for, let's say, a $100 item, let's say $10, and then you pay $10 a month over the course of the next 12 months to kind of pay that item down. And of course, you're paying $10 a month times 12 months. It's $120 plus a $10 deposit. That's $130. You see, that's a lot more than $100 because the installment plan is making you pay an interest rate on that money you're basically getting You're basically being given ahead of time. So that's one of the negatives of buying on credit, is having to pay interest on that. People don't give you money for free. And then secondly, investors borrowed money and purchased stock on margin during this period of time, meaning they were not necessarily investing their own money in the stock market, but rather borrowing from a bank or a stockbroker to get money into the stock market. And there's an example of an installment plan, $1 per week, and you can buy that nice outfit. Why pay cash? So looking at margin a little more carefully here at question number 28. During this period of time, because we had what was considered to be a bull market, meaning that things were really going well in the stock market, people became very confident in the stock market. So what they did is they began feeling like they were missing out if they weren't investing in the stock market. They saw the stock going up. So what a lot of people did was they began to borrow money to kind of get their money into the market. And they would only be investing 10% of their money. So let's say they wanted to invest $1,000. They would invest only $100 of their own money, and they would borrow $900 to invest the rest in the stock market. But what you need to do when you invest in the stock market is you have to anticipate the worst case scenario, not the best case scenario. So a lot of people did not anticipate a sudden drop in the stock market. And there's two different ways to look at the stock market, and I kind of bolded them out for you. The bull stock market is when it's going up, and the bear stock market is when it's going down. So you see that image there, the bulls and the bears. Sometimes you watch, let's say, a news program at the end of a day, sometime after 4 o'clock on a weekday. You'll see whether the bulls or the bears did well for that particular day. Okay, explain how the free enterprise system works in America. It's a capitalistic system. In a free market society, privately owned businesses have the freedom to operate for profit with little government intervention. 31, explain how the free enterprise system helped to spur the consumer revolution in the 1920s. Business owners were motivated to innovate and develop new products because a lot of people were buying products during this period of time. And as a result, they knew that if they invested in the creation of a new product, they used advertisements to promote their products, they had an opportunity to create and make a great profit. 32, think about some of the reasons why population in cities grew during this period of time. Immigrants were settling in cities. There was a lot of hope and opportunities in the United States. Many farmers during this period of time who were struggling began to move into cities. During this period of time, people from south of the border, Mexicans crossed the border to settle in a lot of cities in the United States. And then, of course, the great migration of African Americans from the south to the north contributed to the expansion of northern cities. And what we like to do anytime we do a lesson is we have a lesson reflection question where you kind of think about the totality of what we've been discussing and kind of make your own conclusion. So for this particular one here, think about the question and you can kind of respond out even before I show you a response. Why was a decade of the 1920s a transformational decade for the United States? So you might want to think about what you would respond to before I take you through the response, kind of your own opinion. And some of the possibilities here for the lesson reflection. The United States emerged as an economic and military power. We had a wide availability of new products. The automobile increased mobility for Americans, and we saw a tremendous growth in the American suburbs. So that'll conclude our discussion of the 1920s here. We'll continue along as we move forward. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.